We are in July, so we're in this American Ideals series, and I told you guys before, I was like, I don't know that I want to talk about this. It feels kind of weird or corny or patriotic or whatever, but it is the 250th anniversary of the country. There is a little bit of a celebration. Somebody last night in my neighborhood was actually still shooting off fireworks, and I was like, I looked out the window and I was like, bruh. Like, if you haven't blown them off yet, if you haven't done your fireworks yet, now's the time. See, this is what happens. It's like 4th of July, everybody's fine. But it's these people that are like, I'm going to keep shooting these off for the next 5 weeks. They're the ones that blow off their fingers. They're the one. And I'm just like, what are you doing? But apparently people are still celebrating. So I guess if they're going to keep celebrating, then we should keep having a conversation about this, right? So what are we celebrating? And so here's what we're doing. We're exploring the myths, the progress, and the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because that's what everybody says that we're celebrating, right? We're celebrating Independence Day. We're celebrating freedom from Britain. Yes! We're celebrating our own independence and freedom. We're celebrating, and then we're celebrating these words. It's not just about freedom from Britain, right? It's about independence. It's about life. It's about liberty. It's pursuit of happiness. It's this idea that people came together, and this is what's astounding. And it truly is astounding. We should be astounded by this. It was the first country to follow up that time of the Enlightenment when people began to think about things different. And for the first time, people said, what would it look like to be not ruled by some authoritarian king? What would it be looked like to actually be ruled by ideals? What would it look like, they said, if we gave our lives and our energy and who we are to these ideals that had been born in the Enlightenment, but began to be lived out through these people as they said, let's live out life. Let's live out the idea of liberty, and let's live out the pursuit of happiness. Not to get too far into things, but we recognize and we see that that's not always been the case. That's why this matters. That's why I want to talk about this. You know that I love to talk about tension. I love to lean into tension. And I might look at somebody and say, well, this country was founded on these ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they say, yeah, do you think we've ever really lived out those ideals? No. The American reality has not always matched the American ideals. Not for everybody, not for most people. But there has been a slow march ahead towards progress. We can't mythologize the past and say, oh, well, no, everybody was cool and everybody was happy and everybody had life. We know that's not true. So we don't mythologize it. We look honestly at it and say, okay, so this is where things were, but this is where it could be. This is what it could look like. This is the hope we could have. And so you had all these leaders through all these decades of time that stood up and said, this is the hope we have, that someday we will live out the ideals that we've said that we believe in, that somehow we still don't quite have. And so that's the idea of this. What does it look like to have hope and to see the promise of that and have progress towards that idea? So in the first week of the series, we had to kind of wrestle with that idea. We had to wrestle with how do we recognize that and how do we see that tension? And why do some people ignore that? Why do some people say, oh no, everything's always been fine. It's all hunky-dory. Like, we're great. Like, no, there's no problems. And other people are able to sit back and say, hey, things need to change because things aren't right. Well, in the first week, we read these words spoken by Jesus that I think give us the fuel to look at ourselves in the mirror and ask those hard questions and to wrestle with the gap that is between ideals and reality. So listen to this. He says, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is in your own eye? I think this is why we sometimes struggle with this idea, and let me just, I hope I can have permission to say this just a little bit, just again, leaning into the tension of this. That's why it's hard sometimes when people say, well, you should just be happy because this is the greatest country in the world. And it's okay to say, no, it can be great, but it can be greater. And there are things that we can do to fix some things where it's not great for everybody. And as long as it's not great for everybody, then it's actually not great for anybody. Which is kind of what I talk about with the good news, that if it's not good news, if this Jesus thing isn't good news for everybody, then really it's not good news for anybody. If it's not good news for everybody, then it's not good news for anyone. So if it's not great for everyone, if it's not one, if everybody can't experience life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then is anybody really experiencing that? So that's sort of what this gets to, is this idea of, are we recognizing, are we seeing the logs in our eyes? Are we seeing the things that the mistakes that we're making before we start pointing out about everybody else? Now, to connect this to a religious idea, I think the most grievous error made by Christians today is when they say, well, I've got it all figured out. I have no missteps. So they think that their job just becomes judging others. That their job is just to look at other people and think, well, they don't have it figured out. The figurative log in your eye, though, has to be dealt with before you can begin to address that of others. But here's what we recognized as we talked about this, and what I think is huge here, is that, okay, so if you do deal with that log, if you recognize that thing, that error in your own life before you start judging everybody else, you can't ignore the surgery that it took to remove that log. Because it means that everybody, we're all going to have some scars. The removal of those things in our life that were the missteps or the mistakes that we have in our own lives that we're trying to address before we address others. Now, I want to be really cautious. Okay, I want to be really cautious about this, because here's how we're not supposed to live. We're not supposed to live in a state of perpetual regret. I don't think what Jesus is saying, okay, take the log out of your own eye and then make sure to wake up every morning, look in the mirror and be like, oh man, I got these big old scars and I'm so terrible. And like, I don't think that's the sense. I don't think that's the idea that we're supposed to have here. We're not made to be stuck. We're not made to live stuck in the past or in our past mistakes. But here's what we are meant to do. We're meant to learn from them. We're supposed to take that into what we're doing. We're supposed to move forward in our lives. So we develop these scars, but then we recognize what caused those in the first place. Now, this is what is so foundational to this sermon series. That as we look at the choices that we make as a country, as we look at the choices that we make as individuals, we can either use those choices to serve to bless people around us, or we can harm people around us. We can learn from the mistakes of our past, the things that we did, and we can learn from those so that we are able to bless the people around us, or we don't learn from those mistakes and we cause further harm. And I think that's kind of the tension, if I can be honest about this, I think that's the tension that most of us live with in this country. I think when we're taught correctly about our history, we recognize some of the ugly stuff that took place. And there are people who say, hey, y'all, if we don't learn from our past and we don't look at the way that we treated people, we're going to repeat it. We're going to do the same thing again. And sometimes on this side of things, we look around and we say, guys, we're doing the same stuff. We're doing the same stuff to these people. They're just different people, but it's the same thing we did to those people. We need to learn from our mistakes so that these people can have life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. And some people look and they go, well, no, it wasn't really that bad. They're fine. You know, it's fine. Everything's cool. No, you have to learn from your mistakes. And I think it takes, and it's a hard conversation, but it is a conversation of looking around and saying, hey, we don't want to be there. We want to continue to move forward in our lives. But the same thing is true of us as individuals. We as individuals have to make that choice. It's so easy in this world just to start pointing fingers. I'm just as guilty as everybody else. It's super easy just to say, well, that guy or that guy. But what did we just learn? What about the log in your own eye? So as we take this look at our own lives, it challenges us to think about what this means within us. What am I doing? How am I addressing these things? How am I looking at the past and saying, I don't want this for these? So how can I work in my own life, in my daily decisions to make an impact and a change and a difference? How can I bless others here today who are hurt and who are suffering? How can I be the kind of person who makes those kind of decisions and learns from the past, learns from my past, learns from the past, and begins to change the future in this world? And I think if we do that, I think as individuals, I think as community members, citizens of the country, then we can live out these ideals. That's how you live it out. You learn from it and you move forward and you push forward. And then you get to that place, and here, listen again to these words, that all men are created equal, that we are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And do I look around and do I live out that ideal? Do I say, yeah, I believe all these people in my life, everyone I look at is created equal, that everybody has these rights that have been given to them. Life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Again, but when we're honest in our assessment of our shared history, just as we're called to be honest in our lives, we'll see that significant difference. We'll see that gap between ideals and reality. But a gap is something we do something about. As we learn from our past mistakes, we bless our neighbors, and we become the people we claim to be. Now, again, this is where we find the tension. And this is where we find an incredible tension that I really want to focus on today. Because here's the really odd thing. I want to go back to the statement here for a second. I want to take this apart from a historical place, and then I want to address it and how I want to talk about this through a scripture piece. So let's keep this up, Tim, for a while here. So number one, there's a lot of language going on here, right? All men are created equal. We understand that they are talking about all men and women, all people, or maybe they weren't and they should have, right? And then when they say all men are created equal, we think, yeah, they're talking about everybody. Well, maybe they weren't, but maybe they should have. Maybe somebody in the room is like, do we really mean all people? And somebody's like, well, I don't know about all people. And somebody else is like, I think all people. So there's already a tension that there are some people questioning and asking and saying, what does it mean? What do we do with this? How do we live this out? But that's the beauty of it, is that it moves, it shifts, it has the ability to become what it needs to be, so that it is all people are created equal, that all are endowed by their Creator. Now, I talked about this, and I won't get too far into this, but I'm just going to address this. When they talk about Creator, most of the founders were not evangelical Protestant Christians. They were deists. They didn't have the same set of belief. They believed that there was a God that started things and then just sort of stepped away and let things sort of move as they are. Now, this is history. This is scholarship. We know these things. We know that Thomas Jefferson actually made his own little Bible by ripping out the stuff he didn't like, and mostly miracles and all different kinds of things that he took out. We know that honestly, I think the founding of the country sounds like the Wild West of religion. It sounds like a lot of fun. People had all kinds of crazy different ideas and things that were going on, and they looked at things in all these different ways. So when they said Creator, they were not pointing to a very specific understanding of a Protestant evangelical 2026 God. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So what they were doing is they were just saying, whatever started this thing, whatever pushed us into this world, whatever got us here, gave us these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's fine. Because what this does is it puts everybody on equal ground. So if you are that very much, you have a very certain view of God, you have a certain understanding of maybe Jesus and the Holy Spirit, you have a certain way that you look at who God is. And again, we can see that there are a lot of different ways people view God, even within Christianity and Protestant Christianity itself. You see it a certain way, you're in. You're a part of this. You're welcome to the party to have a conversation with this. But a person over here who says, well, my Creator is a I don't know, some star somewhere that exploded and somehow the stars came into being and come together and they form these humanity and this life. And we're here, and that creation, that creator of those things has also endowed me with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Good, you're welcome to the party. That's why America's cool, because you can all be a part of it. Everybody gets to be here. And we can all pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness together, and we can all find the ways that we get there. Does that make sense? All right, not to soapbox too much, but I'm just kind of tired of it. You know what? I am going to soapbox it, because I think that becomes a problem. I really do. I think that sometimes we think, well, you can't have life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness without this particular way of understanding it. No, we can find a way to understand life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness through my particular lens, and I think it's a lens that is a very valuable lens to have. But people can also find life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from different lenses. And the thing to do is not look and say, well, your lenses are broken, but to find where mine are broken and adjust my sight so that I'm better at pursuing this before I go over and try to fix somebody else's lens. See, it all ties back to what Jesus said. Quit judging other people. Welcome everybody to the party, and let's go have some fun. See? Man, I think Bill and Ted were right. Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes. That's what I think the founder, could you imagine Thomas Jefferson saying that? I'm just like, sorry, okay, let's not. All right, but this is where we find the tension, and here's why we find it. Because we have been trained to be inherently selfish. We have been trained to be selfish people. We have been trained to get ours before everybody else gets theirs. But this statement pushes against that. It pushes against this idea. It says, no, we're all created equal. We all need to be at the same starting line. We all need to figure out how to get everybody there. And we all need to recognize that we're all trying to move together so that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness isn't achieved by some people some of the time, once in a time, but that everybody gets there together at the same time. And that we continue to move forward. That's what has to happen. But in this country, the problem is we tend to reward selfish individualism. But the gap between ideals and our reality is only bridged when we give up this idea of individualism and we recognize this idea of love. When we get away from a selfish individualism and begin to accept a sacrificial love. Does that make sense? So much of the time, and I just think this gets pushed so much. I don't understand why we're so obsessed. Like, I was just thinking about this yesterday and talking to Mom, and we were discussing this idea that you have these people who they carry themselves, and this idea of like self-made. Look what I did. Look how I got myself here. And somehow we like look at that and say, boy, that's what we want. I don't know why. Number one, I don't think it's true. Nobody's self-made. Everybody is building upon the collective goodness of other people in their lives. Everybody has somebody else to thank for the place that they find themselves. Nobody is self-made. But the other thing is with it is that there's just this idea that somehow to push back against that, to say that there's a different way to be, that somehow we look and say, well, that's not who we're supposed to be. Well, what if instead we said, you know what? Let's stop celebrating. Let's stop celebrating this idea of selfish individualism, and let's start celebrating people who stand up and say, I want to thank the people who should be here. I want to thank the people who didn't get me here, but who I'm going to help get here too. What would it look like if we began to think collectively? What would it look like if we began to pull together and try to make an impact and a difference and not just get ours? What would it look like if we learned to bridge the gap between ideals and reality? Again, not with this selfish individualism, but with sacrificial love. And this, my friends, this is the kind of love that Jesus taught to his first followers. There's a letter, it's called Galatians, and this man named Paul writes this, and he talks about this love that Jesus taught. Listen to this. He says, you, saying to these people, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. So he's writing to these Galatians and these people in this community, and he says, you people in Galatia, you were called to freedom. Brothers and sisters. He says, y'all were invited. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love, become enslaved to one another. Now wait, now listen to this. Listen, I just want to listen to this. Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. Now that is like a trip, because most of us are like, all right, I got freedom to do what I want. I'm going to do what I want. And I'm going to do what I want to get what I want so I can get where I want to be. He says, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. He says, but through love, use your freedom for this way. Use your freedom to become enslaved to one another. And then he says, for the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. And here's the commandment Jesus gave. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Paul knew something that Jesus had talked about. He's like, remember, Jesus said this thing, to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the greatest thing, that sums it all up. That love is the answer here. Now again, we find this teaching in a letter written by a man named Paul. He's writing to several groups of Jesus followers who lived in this region of the world called Galatia. Now Galatia, this is so important in our context, right? We talk about this. The context is the Roman Empire. And one of the reasons these words of freedom here were used here and were so relevant to the churches who received these letters is because freedom was not a word that they were used to. They were used to systems of oppression. They were used to that the way the world works is not by people having a freedom to do, but having oppression to be this way. Control, do this. You had authoritarian people in Rome controlling, and then you also had religious people who were controlling. Do this, don't do that, definitely don't do that. Do this, and then you also had the authorities who were the Roman people say, do this, do that, don't do that, definitely don't do that, and do this. And so all of these things are working as oppression over people. Jesus comes along and says, you have now been set free. You are set free to experience freedom with each other, freedom to love, freedom to give, freedom to get out of this place of oppression, freedom to be, and then that freedom begins to push off into all these different parts of life. And so they're trying to get a handle on, well, what do we do with this freedom now, this religious freedom we've been given, this different way of seeing and experience the life? See, the kind of oppression and the power dynamics that fueled it were taking place in churches. The churches began to experience the same oppression that they were supposed to be set free from. And he's like, no. You guys, you're screwing it up. You're messing the whole thing up. You're corrupting the very thing the church was meant to become. You're tearing at the ideals of what the church is supposed to be built upon. So Paul recognized this, and he also saw how the teaching of Jesus, this self-sacrificial love, was the thing needed to bridge the gap between the ideals the churches claimed to follow and the reality which many of the people were experiencing within them. Do you guys get that? Let me read that again. Paul saw how this oppression was tearing at churches, how people were treating each other, that their freedom was towards self-indulgence. Paul saw this. And he said, there's something that has to happen. He said, you're not going to bridge the gap between the ideals that you claim to have and the reality that we need to be by just wanting to get there. He says, you're not going to get from here to there. You're not going to get from this place to where we're supposed to be by just saying the right words. You're not going to get from here to there by just agreeing with the ideas. He said, the only way that you are going to get from this place to this place, the only way that you are going to get from ideals to reality is through the self-sacrificial love. And this same lesson he gave them is just as relevant for you and me today. The self-sacrificial love that we find in the teaching of Jesus is the same love which gives us the ability to bridge that gap between our ideas and our reality. So if you want to live out the ideal of liberty, we'll find that the only way to do it is to see that real freedom doesn't look inward, it looks outward. True freedom looks outward at our neighbors and it asks, how do I love? The failure of the American experiment, as I have said before, is when we have chosen to pursue life, liberty, and happiness for ourselves without seeking it for others. That's the failure. The failure is when I say, I love the words of the Declaration. I love life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, so don't tread on me. It's a fine flag. I'm not bashing my Texan brothers and sisters here, okay? But it should be don't tread on us. And if we're really going to be good, it should be don't tread on them. I mean, the real flag, especially for those who say they follow Jesus, our flag should be don't tread on them. Because that's what we're supposed to do. That's how we're supposed to live. We're supposed to look inside and say, oh, you know what? Forget me. I'm worried about them. That's where I'm supposed to be. That's what I'm supposed to do. Because that's what Jesus did. Jesus said, I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about Kurt. And I'm worried about Matt. I'm worried about Kathy. Don't worry about me. I want them to have life. I want them to flourish. I want that. He said, and now you go, and this is the power of the Christian message. He said, now you go live the same. It means nothing to just simply say, cool, thank you for that. I appreciate that. It does nothing to look and say, thank you so much. I appreciate you doing that for me. What you should say is, my goodness, if he could do that for me, I could do that for others, this world would look so different. If I would stop saying, don't tread on me, and I'd say, don't tread on them. Man, can you imagine how the world would begin to change? Now we have an opportunity for this. The great Ray Charles sang so beautifully, God shed his grace on thee. And I started thinking about that song, and I've thought about this so many times. Did you ever notice he didn't say God shed his goodness on us? God shed riches upon us. God shed his wealth on thee. God shed his grace. And I started thinking about that. Because I started thinking about the different ways that we sing songs. And we sing these songs like, God bless America. You know, and we talk about this idea, and I'm proud to be an American. You know, at least I know I'm free. But this is interesting. He sings these words, God shed his grace on. I started to think to myself, well, that kind of seems like a mistake. I mean, because I think we're not focused on grace, we're focused on blessings. We want God's blessings, don't we? Why is he giving us his grace? Well, I don't think it's a mistake. See, it's mercy that God gives us when we fail to be who we claim to be. It's mercy that God gives you and me when we have the missteps and we say, this is who I am, but this is who I want to be. Grace is seeing our scars that we talked about, learning from them, and working to bridge the gap between who we are and who we claim to be. And this is where I think there's a meta version of this and a micro version. The meta version is that God has shed his grace on a people. God did shed his grace on a people who said, we believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and enslaved a whole bunch of people. God shed his grace on people when they said everybody should have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then placed guns at the heads of indigenous people and said, march. God showed grace to people. God shows us his grace. When a people who said, bring your tired and you're weary upon this land. And then people look and say, go back where you came from. God is still showing his grace. But that's the meta version. What about the version for you and me? How many times does God show his patience and his grace to us when we aren't the kind of people that we claim to be? When we sing songs about love and grace and goodness and mercy and compassion, and then don't show it to the neighbor next door. Don't show it to the person in our store. Don't show it to the coworker. Don't show it to the person at school. Don't show it to the people around us that don't love like God wants us to love. Grace is seen and learning from and becoming and allowed to become who we claim to be. Countless people throughout our complicated history, like the writer of the song, found themselves where many of us are today. Desiring an America we want, as we live in the America we have. And what's funny is that is quintessentially American. It is also very much the essence of following Jesus. Being people of hope who ask for God to show us grace as we continue to learn to live as people, not as selfish individuals, but learn to be people of sacrificial. Man, that's goodness. That's incredible grace. That's what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. God, show me grace as I become who you want me to be. God, we thank you for these words. We thank you for this challenge. Thank you for this series that continues to have us ask hard questions about the kind of people we are as citizens, as people who live within this country, but also what it means to be Jesus followers amid that. Help us to continue to take a hard look at our lens that we read these words through, the lens with which we are trying to impact and change the world, but help us to also see the places where maybe we have some mistakes, maybe we have some cracks, maybe we have some places that we're not being who we claim to be. God, that has to happen on an individual level, each one of us having a hard conversation with ourselves, recognizing those scars, not living in the past, but hoping for the future. Help us to gather the hands of those around us to walk together towards that place, that you would help us become exactly who we're called to be. It's your name that we pray. Amen.